Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about Commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz, and I'm joined by my fantastic co-host. He was thinking of building the Commander 6, but he realized that if he did, it would be about a 7. It's Matt Morgan.
So recently I had somebody come over to my house and they said, "Hey, I really like your ceiling." And I said, "It's not the best, but it is up there."
I don't know. I think you kind of had to vault a little bit too high there to reach the punchline on that one there, Matt.
I don't think so. I think that one's just over your head. That's my stance.
Yeah, no, you're right. Your dad jokes are really raising the roof, aren't they?
They are. That's my favorite slang from 2003 that you just brought back.
Hey, no, you can't flip it on me like that. Okay, all right. Matt, it's the two of us here today talking about some Magic stuff. What is our topic on this week's episode?
Well, this week we were talking a little bit back and forth and trying to figure out what we want to talk about. We realized there's a lot of redundancies that we're talking about right now. Why don't we just talk about redundancies in Commander? Because that seems to fit.
Yes, redundant Commander redundancies. This is the pin number episode, the ATM machine episode, so to speak. I guess kind of like the question we want to ask is how much is too much? Like how many backups for your commander's abilities are a little bit too much? Is that kind of where we're going?
Yeah, I mean, when your commander does the thing, how many other times do you want cards to be doing the same thing? Or do you want to move on and just do something that's going to complement the thing that you want to be doing with the commander?
Yeah, I'm excited to get into it. This will be, there's a lot to learn, I think. But real quick, we've got some shout outs that we got to do first. First, we're delighted to be part of Team Ultimate Guard. They have such amazing products that we use for our decks. We use the Boulder deck boxes. Matt, I know you're a huge fan of their Sidewinders as well. Mm-hmm. And those katana sleeves are brilliant. Sometimes when I'm just absent-mindedly, I need something to do with my hands, I just want to shuffle my decks because of how good those sleeves feel. So yeah, Team Ultimate Guard all the way. Absolutely.
When I'm at events, I mean, Joey, you were at Command Fest Tacoma, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, one thing that I love when I go to the Command Fest or any of those of big events, I have one of those Smart Hives by Ultimate Guard. That is just such a perfect all-in-one solution. It's got my decks in there. It's got a space for my tokens, for extra cards, dice, all that. It is just the perfect on-site solution whenever you're at any Command Fest, Magic Con, anything like that.
Yeah, terrific stuff. If you want to be bold with your deck boxes, you can get the bold. Okay, never mind. I'm gonna be done now.
I'm just going to tell people instead how they can support the show. And of course, there's easy ways to do it, whether it's liking this video, subscribing on YouTube, subscribing on local podcast apps. Those are all just fantastic ways that we definitely appreciate. Just 5 seconds of support. But if you want to go to patreon.com/EDHRECast, our listeners can get themselves a nice little benefit in return for supporting the show that way, whether it's joining our Discord community, finding games that are always popping off. We have a channel specifically set aside in our Discord server to find games with other patrons. It's just an amazing thing that's going on. Mm-hmm. Our mods are always playing games. It's super active community. I cannot recommend that enough. And it's just $2 a month over at patreon.com/EDHRECast. And another special perk that you can get for yourself, we give a very special shout out, very coveted shout out. And this week, Steph Jacobs, thank you for the awesome support. And I can't even think of anything clever or just to do with your name. So Steph, I'm just going to give you a very sincere thank you for the support. You are awesome.
Matt, I gotta say, I appreciate the evolution here. You've set up my expectation to always have some type of silly pun whenever we get around to the shout-outs. But for you to do a little turn cloaky kind of thing and it's just actually really sincere, you never manage to not throw me off. You know, you are always surprising me. And that keeps every episode fresh for me, and I adore it.
That's the key to being a good boxer. You got to keep people on their toes. Steph Jacobs is keeping me on my toes. We're just going to say thank you again for the support.
Yeah, seriously. Steph, thank you so much. And with that, Matt, now we're getting into our topic here. We're talking about some redundancies in Commander. Particularly what we're kind of interested in are those effects that mimic what your commander does. Basically, we would call them just backup plans in your deck. And it's usually pretty wise to have some type of effect to back up for your commander, right? Because, your commander's not always going to be in play. People are going to try and kill it. So it seems like a pretty natural inclination for us to have some other effects in the 99 that can serve as a backup plan for the commander. I assume that we're on the same page with this general philosophy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You always want to have some sort of plan, and usually if the plan's worth doing once, we like to say on the show all the time, the plan's worth doing a second time, or sometimes even a third. But when do you get to the point of diminishing returns with having so many versions of that one thing in your deck? That's the answer we want to kind of shop through and kind of have maybe a thought experiment, if you will, about when does this redundancy become actually redundant itself?
Yes, exactly. And I think a good potential entryway into this conversation is something stuck out to me from a past episode, actually, where we were talking about your Omnath Locus of Rage deck. Fantastic, famous Gruul Landfall, making all the elementals whenever your lands hit the field. But it actually came out on that episode a while back that you don't play the card Rampaging Baloths in that Landfall deck.
Right.
Because to you, that was actually, instead of it being a backup plan, to you it felt a little bit redundant. You were like, I don't really need this. But Rampaging Baloth is an extraordinarily popular card in Landfall decks. So, let's examine why people do play it a whole bunch in that type of deck and why you don't, and just sort of investigate what's going on here.
Yeah, and I know that that's kind of a controversial thing to do when I'm playing a Landfall deck and not playing one of the most popular Landfall payoffs in the format. I mean, Rampaging Baloth is in over 135,000 decks out there. And we went into this whole kind of topic in a previous episode. We were talking about what a deck wants versus what it needs. And we kind of want to go back into the deck obviously wants these effects, but how many times do you want to repeat it? Because again, I don't really need, I guess, in my Omnath Locus of Rage deck, another copy of Rampaging Baloth. One of the big reasons in that deck is because I'm ramping already. And so most oftentimes, by the time I'm ready to or need to recast Omnath Locus of Rage, the redundancy, it's kind of built into the deck with just the fact that Omnath can just ramp, cast himself. If he dies, you're just ramping some more anyways. And so really the deck doesn't need it because the commander tax doesn't really matter all that much in a lot of different games with Omnath Locus Rage, at least in the version that I've built for it.
And that's an important distinction for us to mention here, because it's like it's like 58% of Omnath decks are playing it. Like it's a popular among the staple cards. It's just as popular in Omnath decks as Elemental Bond. Yeah,
and there's never any one hard and fast rule for building a deck. People build what you want to play. I mean, that is the number one rule. I mean, well, rule 0, I guess, if you're playing Commander, but building what you want to play and making sure that any pressure if it's put on your deck, it's put on there by yourself, not by other people, not by what you think EDHREC is telling you should play. Because again, EDHREC, we love to say this, it's not prescriptive, it's just a mirror showing what other people are doing.
Yeah, EDH recommendations, not EDH you're forced to play any of these cards. Absolutely. A thing that I think is kind of illuminative, if that's a word, for this particular example here is to actually go through some of the effects that you are using in this deck to kind of get the logic behind here. Because you do have some cards in that Omnath deck that are serving sort of as redundancy-ish effects. Like they make tokens as landfall effects. They have something that is similar. They approximate what Omnath is doing there if Omnath isn't itself in play. We know that Rampaging isn't necessarily one of them, but I looked through some of our lists to find some of these numbers here, and for your Omnath list, I counted about 4-ish other landfall payoff cards that will do something that helps you, terminate your opponents the more lands that you play. 4 is not a huge number, I don't think.
No.
And crucially, 2 of those 4 are actually lands. There aren't a whole bunch of effects in that deck that you've got going on that will do the exact same thing that Omnath is doing, which I think is a little bit unusual. We're used to seeing a lot of token makers, a lot of those types of effects, but you only have a couple. One of them is Titania. She also makes elementals, but that complements Omnath.
Yes.
One of them is Field of the Dead. Well, that's a land. That's not even really taking up a card slot in your deck. And 2 of the others are Valakut effects, which deal direct damage. And so you're actually, those ones that are doing damage, they're not even just making tokens, they're approaching it in a slightly different way. And I think that is kind of a way for us to get into this conversation about what are some solutions here when it comes to the backup plans, quote unquote, that you do in fact run, because they are attacking from a different angle rather than being something that would be a little bit too similar. And I think that's what has the Baloth example kind of so important to you as this for Omnath specifically.
Yeah, and for this deck, and I know we're spending a lot of time talking about this one deck, but it's just kind of a gateway because we've mentioned this deck. I mean, I've played more games with this deck than any other deck. I've had it. It's one of my very first decks that I ever built. So it's been through a lot of reps, and more so than it's older than the podcast at this point. But yeah, I like your point that you said, Joey, about I'm playing a bunch of cards that are going to complement what Omnath is doing, not try to supplant it, because that's where I think a lot of different players and a lot of different decks kind of get torn is I'm trying to dilute the deck, but I'm putting in so many payoffs versus setup cards, and that's a whole other topic we've done an episode on. But for me specifically with this Omnath deck, I would 1,000% rather run cards like Ancient Green Warden that are going to maximize the best version of what I could be doing instead of adding another slightly worse version. Ancient Green Warden, that's just going to make what the best version of what I'm doing make all that more impact. And that's what I think a lot of people kind of get torn between when they're building their decks.
Yeah, I actually notice, I would say in that deck you have many more amplifiers that like are enhancing what Omnath is doing. The Where Agents Tread of like, oh, I'm dealing even more damage with these things.
Yeah.
So you are all eggs in one basket for what that commander's doing.
Yep.
And that is a dangerous bit of territory to tread in. I build very, very commander-centric decks. And if you kill off my commander, often I'm just up the creek without a paddle. Like, it can really take me out of a game. And that is, of course, why we want to have these backup plans, why we want redundant effects to be in our decks. Because if our commander dies, we might be completely out of the game. So I get like the instinct of like why we want to have those backup plans, but you are really all eggs in one basket. And that's actually not the only deck where that's the case for you. In fact, it's not the only deck that's the case for any of us. I went through a couple of other numbers of the decks here that I've put down in the show notes here. If you want to get into some of these that like, oh, actually, how many redundancy or backup exact copy quote unquote effects of our commander are we playing in our 99s? And Matt, it turns out it's not a whole lot.
No, I very much am high risk, high reward when I build my decks. I like all eggs in one basket. I love just that, like, I'm going to do this one thing. I'm going to do it really well. Stop me if you can. That's just been my attitude towards Magic for a long time. And so, yeah, I very much, I like the one thing and I back it up a little bit. But my Kyler's Guardian Emissary, I love this green-white humans deck. Why would I want to play a bunch of bad anthems when I have the best anthem in the command zone already? So I have some like pseudo anthems in there, but really it's all in on like, I'm going to get this best anthem and I'm going to support it the best way that I can. And there's fun cards like Slippery Bog Bonder that are going to not supplant it, but support it and build it up and protect it. And so that's the one reason that I think I like Kyler so much is it's just the best anthem I could be playing. It's in the command zone. Why would I want to be doing anything else?
Yeah, as an example there, like another anthem I do notice is in your deck is a Vanquisher's Banner. But honestly, like, yeah.
That's card draw. That's card draw.
Exactly. Yeah, it's doing something else in the same way that in your Landfall deck, Valakut was doing something else. It's attacking from a different angle. And I think that's a really important point for us to hit home about how you can make sure that your redundancies, your backups, aren't actually useless. They aren't actually just because, like, sure, your board is more powerful if you have both of those in play, but that card slot could actually be very, very valuable. Like, if you were doing exactly the same thing over and over again, you are potentially opening yourself up to a board wipe completely taking you down.
Yep.
And you could be using that card slot for something like protection or whatever. Like, you might risk overextending or something. And like, that's certainly not the only case. We talked about a couple of your decks, but it turns out I actually have plenty of decks that have similar ratios here. Like my Thalise deck, that's a black-white tokens deck. She will make you extra spirits for each token that you've made on the end step. Like, oh, it's great. I love that one. I have only 2 other token multiplier effects in the 99 of that deck. That's Anointed Procession and Mondrak. That's it. Like, they are also token doublers. And they're great. They're very good. It's nice to have those in case Thalise can't stick around and play.
Yeah.
But I guess the reason I wanted to do an episode like this with you is because we kind of realized, like, let's say that there were 10 of those effects, right? Let's say that there were 10 Anointed Processions I could run. I'm not going to. Like, that would be overkill.
Yeah.
I don't need that many. And that's the conversation we want to have. That's the thing we want to unpack.
Well, and it's mostly because, like I mentioned before, adding in so many copies of the same type of effect, it's watering down and eventually going to get to a point where there's significant diminishing returns where, okay, I'm sitting with, say you do have 10 token doublers, increasers, whatever, in that deck. Well, there's going to be situations later in the game where you have one on the board already and then you're drawing one. Okay, well, that doesn't help the one that's already on the board. And maybe next turn you draw another one. So you have 2 dead cards or 2 dead draws, I guess, where you're going to be wanting to draw cards that are going to, make that token doubler pay off and actually do the thing that you want it to be doing. And it's just dilution of that effect. I think that is something that players get tempted with so many times, especially with Commander being kind of the show pony of Wizards of the Coast design. We're getting a lot of options for whatever you want to be doing. And eventually, like, instead of just adding another one to your deck and cutting something else, you got to start cutting that effect. And it's such a difficult situation to navigate. I hate it. It's probably my least favorite thing about updating decks. That's probably why I don't update my decks very often.
I can feel that. I think as another potential example here to kind of hammer home this idea of like attacking it from a different angle, another one that I looked at was my Yannette deck, which is my Esper top deck manipulation matters. Whenever Yannette attacks, I can flip the top card. If it's an odd mana cost, she can cast it for free. Love that deck. Yannette's definitely got a pretty big target on her, though. No one wants me to cheat free 9-drops into play. That's a little bit scary. So I do have other effects that care about the top card of my library in that deck, but I only have about 5 of them. And specifically, they're not doing the same type of like cheating things into play effect that Yannette is doing. I actually made that deck into like a Baneful Omen and Keen Duelist or Twilight Prophet type of deck.
Yeah.
Things that look at the top card of your deck and they deal damage equal to the mana cost of that card. So even if Yannette's not in play, I have another thing that can actually still push me forward towards winning the game. But crucially, they're doing it in a different way than Yannette is doing, where Yannette's specifically trying to cheat something into play and trying to make use of combat. These are actually just like, hey, we're going to bypass combat completely. We actually don't care about what you already have in play. This is just caring about doing some damage. And again, that's a different angle of attack. And I wouldn't need too many other versions of those effects, I guess. But like that's the thing I just kind of want to like really hammer home of. The thing that makes those important or special or helpful is that they can be in play with Yannette at the same time, and it doesn't feel like I'm losing out on too much because it doesn't feel like they're just repeating the same verses that Yannette is doing. They actually can do something else that complements her while they are both in play. So that doesn't make me feel like, oh, well, I shouldn't cast this card because I've already got my commander in play. It actually allows me to push the pedal to the metal at the times that I need it, and it allows me to work even if Yannette is not actually there. Like having both of those quadrants be hit feels very, very helpful and prevents those cards from ever feeling dead.
Yeah, well, and one thing that we kind of get into the situation, and we both have hit it here, is you get into situations where you do have dead cards. And we had a really good conversation before we started recording that I really want to kind of drill into and talk about for the audience here. You had mentioned that every time you're playing a card like Tamiyo Safekeeping or Heroic Intervention, you're playing another copy of your best card or whatever card is on the battlefield, your commander, for example. And I want you to kind of unpack that a little bit because I thought it was super interesting.
Yeah.
And the more that I thought about it, it applied to me too. So can you expand on what you mean by Tamiyo Safekeeping is just another copy of your commander?
I mean, effectively, that is what it's doing, right? When you cast a Tamiyo Safekeeping to give Indestructible and Hexproof to your commander, you're negating an opponent's removal spell, most commonly. But really what you're doing is preventing yourself from having to cast your commander again. So the way that I can look at a Tamiyo Safekeeping or any other type of protective spell is just that, like, this is, when it's in my hand, this is another version of my whatever huge creature I currently have in play. This is just no, it will stay. It will definitely stay. And the reason that kind of came up in our conversation was about like finding the balance of these effects.
Yeah.
Because I think it's definitely the case that these types of protective cards, when you're actually like in the deck building stage, the things that those are competing for slots with are the other backup plans. They're not competing for slots with your ramp or your card draw or any of those. They're competing specifically with other cards that also will progress forward your game plan, other backups, other things that could be redundant. So yeah, those cards that can save your most important thing, to me, I just view them as, well, that kind of is another copy of my most important thing. It is signaling to me how much I care about having all eggs in one basket or having a broad range of different types of things in case my commander dies. That's kind of it. Does that unpack enough? Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense.
It certainly does. And we talked about it a lot. And the more that I've been thinking about this too, cards like Revitalizing Repass, which we talked about, and all of these protection spells, that field is getting so crowded now that you have to really consider, okay, do I need more copies of my commander in the way that you explained it, or do I need to be doing something else that's going to kind of complement my game plan? And you really got me thinking about cards. So when I try to play Brawl, and try is a big word because Brawl is it's a hard format to like right now if you play on Arena, at least for me it is. But I play a Rusko Clockmaker deck, and that deck is all about, I need a midnight clock on the battlefield. And for those of you who don't play Brawl very much, basically, when Rusko enters the battlefield, you create a copy of Midnight Clock on the battlefield, and then when you recast an instant or sorcery, it drains your opponent for 1. So I don't mind having beyond redundancy because Rusko has a huge target on its back, but also whenever you enter the battlefield, you're going to get another copy of Midnight Clock. So I'm playing a ton of cards like Feign Death, where, okay, you're going to kill my commander, but it's just going to come right back, and then I'm going to get that ETB trigger again. And it got me thinking, like, when does it get to the point of redundancy with those effects in Rusko? And honestly, I don't know with that deck specifically where that line is drawn.
That really is just it. We're at an odd tipping point in EDH where backup plans feel less valuable nowadays, and going all eggs in one basket is more rewarded.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of the equivalent of how sometimes the best creature removal is player removal.
Yeah.
Like when the best way to get thing X off of the battlefield is to just go above it and nuke the player, because sometimes EDH is better at getting you into lethal board positions than it is at producing pinpoint interaction. So in much the same way, sometimes the best backup plan is protecting the commander rather than having a copycat effect waiting in the wings in case it dies. And over time, I think this ends up being one of the biggest things that changes as we tune our decks. Like, the redundancies are likeliest to be felt in the early stages of brewing. And I guess to kind of try and give an example of this, I mentioned earlier how my Thalisse deck only played like 2 cards with effects that mimic Thalisse if she's not in play. But as a contrasting example, I looked at the numbers of my Karazakar Goad deck, and that deck used to have 12 other cards that goad things.
Which, a deck that I'm very glad you lowered the number of goad effects on, by the way.
Well, so that's just it. It's 12. It was 12 in the version of the list I was looking over. It was higher than that before. And actually, in the current paper version that I have, I've just lowered it down to like maybe 8 or 7. And that was me realizing, like, oh, I got to go on Architect and update my Karazakar list, actually, because it's not actually accurate at the current moment. I know. So I'm taking after you, Matt, a little bit.
Give yourself some grace. It's okay.
Yeah. But like, that's the thing I've noticed is like, oh, I've actually found that I don't need all of these. Karazakar has the ability to single target goad something whenever I attack an opponent. And I was also playing a lot of other cards, like one of them's called Gloin, which is a dwarf that can single target goad things. I've massively taken down the number of those. And the cards that I now do have still in that deck that do in fact goad stuff approach it from an angle that specifically Karazakar can't approach it from. It's the Disrupt Decorum type of effects. This is a mass goad, or the Bloodthirsty Blade. This is a permanent goad. Like, those are the only remaining goad effects that I have in that deck now. And like, I've had that deck for years, and I'm still learning where my line is supposed to be. So that's what I kind of wanted to mention off that point that you just said. These lines are hard to find. I've been playing this deck for a long time, and I was still playing more effects than it turned out I entirely needed, because of how much my commander has that base covered, and I do need to approach it from different angles. So yeah. Why is this so hard, Matt? Like, what the heck?
I don't know, but I mean, we've all had those adventures in kind of where do we draw the line? How much do we want to actually focus in on this? And then where does it become, what's the point of redundancy? When do I finally start seeing diminishing returns from so many copies of this type of effect in the deck, whether it's doing the things that the commander wants to do, or if it's doing some things that are going to complement? Because sometimes you can have all the complementary cards in the deck, but they're not going to do anything without that main engine to drive them forward. And so it's such a more art than science type of approach. But that is kind of also the beauty of Commander, where you just get to like throw things at the wall, see what sticks, and just build your deck. And that is kind of the beauty of where we get to kind of play this format at.
And there are a few other, I don't know if side effects is the right word, but there are a couple of other ripple effects of some kind that can happen as a result of this, and maybe even some like potential solutions that we can implement. Yeah. But Matt, I think we're going to have to save that for part 2 of the show, because it's about time for us to challenge stats now, isn't it?
It is about that time, yes. And so why don't we hop into it? Let's make some challenges. Let's read some stats.
Yeah, let's take a critical look at the data on EDHREC and come back with Challenge the Stats. This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. Okay, this year has gone by so quickly, so I've got to ask, what's something you're proud of in 2024 so far? And what's something you still want to accomplish this year? When life goes so fast, it's important to take a moment to celebrate your wins and to make adjustments for the rest of the year. Culturally, I think we associate therapy as being only for people who are going through or have gone through especially difficult experiences, but I love that therapy can also just help you take stock of your progress. It's like if you were playing a life gain deck, but you've been taking so many game actions that your life total tracker app made your life total number invisible. Therapy can help you see that total a bit more clearly, and that can help you figure out your next moves from there. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. A brief questionnaire will help match you with a licensed therapist, and, of course, you can switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Take a moment. Visit betterhelp.com/EDH today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/EDH.
Well, Joey, I'll get us started this week with our challenge stats. So Andy Colby sent us an email, which you can do at EDHRECast@gmail.com, or if you would like, you can submit challenges through the Discord channel, which you can get into on our Patreon. But Andy Colby had a really good challenge for a nice anti-synergy that I think a lot of folks are missing on. So Andy said, Mr. House, president and CEO, cares about rolling dice and getting high results to make robots for treasures and tokens. And many people are cramming as many D20 rolling cards in there, and when they could be running more common staples based on how easy the odds are to get the highest payoff with the triggered ability. So for those of you who missed the Fallout set, Mr. House is the Mardu dice rolling commander. It's all about rolling D20s and getting high rolls, because again, if you roll a 6 or higher, you create tokens plus treasures, and then you can pay 4 mana, tap to roll 6-sided dice plus an additional for each of those treasures that you're using to use that ability. So a card that Andy is calling out that I really like is Lae'zel's Acrobatics. And so Lae'zel's Acrobatics, it's 3 and a white for an instant that flickers everything. Then you can flicker all sorts of cards depending on your die roll. Andy goes on to say Lae'zel's Acrobatics is one of those cards that are mainly included in the list because you get to roll a d20. Primarily, it blinks all of your non-token creatures, and depending on your die roll, you roll it maybe twice. But the non-bo here is the order of the text on Acrobatics. It exiles the non-token creatures, and then you roll a d20, so Mr. House will never see the d20 being rolled. So 33% of these Mr. House decks are missing out on it. That's such a non-bo. Yes, it is a flavorful way to skirt board wipes, but that can be done easier with other effects that also are going to save your tokens, which I really like here. This is a really good challenge. I really like Lae'zel's Acrobatics. I've been blown out by it a couple times, and it's just a great card. It's in over 30,000 decks. It's $1. It's a great addition to almost any white deck that has ETB triggers. But Mr. House is definitely not the place for that, because Mr. House, like Andy points out, is never going to see that die being rolled because it's exiled. It's not going to come back until the card actually is done resolving.
Yeah, really, really good point there. That's a great challenge, Andy. Love it. We love overplayed and non-bow challenges. Those are so cool. And actually, speaking of it, I also have an overplayed challenge for my challenge to stats this week. I want to talk about a cleric in Barakos the Folk Hero. This is a deck that I did not expect to fall in love with, but I absolutely did. And this is also a deck where I did not expect to be casually scrolling through the pages of EDHREC one day and then notice that Frontline Medic is still showing up in nearly 2/3 of Barakos decks. And I'm going to call this one overplayed. I'm going to call this a little bit of a precon effect going on here. I think we can do better with our clerics. Frontline Medic is a 3-mana 3/3 human cleric with Battalion, and that means whenever Frontline Medic and at least 2 other creatures attack, creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. And it also has an ability to counter spells with X in their mana cost if you sacrifice it, unless their controller pays 3 mana. That almost never comes up. The main thing is that it's a cleric, which Barakos will care about, and it has an ability to give your stuff indestructible if you attack with enough creatures. I say this as a person who's been playing Barakos for a long time. This is one of the least important clerics that you can possibly play in this deck. Like, the synergy is there. The synergy does exist here because you don't want Barakos to die. Barakos is great to attack. You get the damage trigger and the treasures and like, you want to protect the commander for sure. Totally get that. And it's a cleric, so you'll draw a card, right? The thing is, there are so many amazing clerics that can go into a black-white Barakos deck. You are not hurting for clerics in this deck. Like, Selfless Spirits are all over. Giver and Mother of Runes are both clerics. Archivist of Ogma is one with Flash, and being able to flash things in to draw extra cards off of your folk hero. That's also huge. In my version of this deck, I also play Soltari Visionary, which happens to be a cleric with Shadow that can destroy enchantments when it hits people. Clerics are probably the easiest thing to fill up a party deck with in these colors. Clerics and Warriors, I would say, you are not hurting for Clerics and Warriors. So this this frontline medic, which it needs to have haste of some kind, or you have to wait a turn for it to get that effect, and you need to be attacking with enough creatures, there are just a couple of bars there that I think you can really take this one down a couple of notches and put in a whole bunch of other really important clerics into this deck, because there are so many clerics that can save your entire board. Or I use Disciple of the Vault. If you're really sick of treasures out there, Disciple of the Vault is going to punish people for doing treasures, and it's a cleric. There are so many amazing clerics that you can play in this deck. I think you can knock this one out of the deck. It's a neat idea for a synergy, but as clerics go, I think it's a little bit bottom of the barrel compared to what else you can do. So that is going to be my challenge.
Yeah, both good cards. Talk about redundancies, backup plans, and really, like, there's so many good effects that, like, sometimes being hypercritical of what cards you are including and challenging themselves on your own decks, that's so important to be doing. So I really like both of these challenges this week, because that sometimes you don't need to accept the worst version of something.
Yeah, and it's not like the synergies aren't there, but it's that other cards have a little bit more synergy, and we want to make room for those. That's really the thing that I think we want to get at.
Yeah.
So, okay, Matt, let's get back into our topic here, talking about redundancies. There's kind of an instinct that I mentioned there about, like, with that Karazakar example that I mentioned right before we went to challenge the stats, about, like, I saw a goad deck and I put a bunch of goad stuff in it, and judging by the data on EDHREC, I am not the only one. There are a lot. Like, everyone was like,
true. That is true.
I see the commander does this thing, so I want to fill the deck with a whole bunch of that thing. And for this episode, I kind of want to propose that maybe we need to do the opposite of that.
Okay.
I know.
I really want to see where you're going with this one, but proceed.
So another example that I kind of want to throw here is that I've just recently built an Honest Rutstein deck. That is a Golgari commander, and the main text that matters here is that he reduces the cost of all of your creature spells by 1 generic mana. So it's really easy to play a whole bunch of creatures, and I've got like 40 plus creatures in that deck. You can double spell really fast in the deck. I've honestly, I'm loving it. I love Golgari Aristocrats already, but I built this one as a whole bunch of Aristocrats. It's great. It's fantastic. But the commander is doing the cost reduction for me.
Okay.
So basically what I'm saying is that, like, the least important thing in the 99 are the other things that would accelerate mana. Like, I don't need Jet Medallions.
Okay.
I don't need a lot of ramp spells. The commander already has that base covered. It would be like running a bunch of ramp spells on an elf deck. Like, you're going to mana flood real hard if you do that. Mm-hmm. So what I want to highlight here with this example is that the same instinct that's telling me I don't need to play like 12 ramp spells in my new Rutstein deck is the same logic I should have used before I put like 20 goad cards in the first version of my Karazakar goad deck. Like, I don't need that many, actually. I didn't mana flood, I goad flooded in that version of the deck. Mm-hmm. And the reason that this matters is because every card you have that is doing something that all your other cards are already doing winds up being a card slot that could have been spent on another effect, like removal or draw or ramp or protection, things that could save your life in another circumstance in those card slots. So yeah, basically the solution I'm kind of putting forward here is that sometimes you don't need to reinforce your commander's effects. What you actually need to do is run in the opposite direction and find ways to cover bases your commander doesn't cover.
Yeah. Well, and I like where you're going at. So for a long, long time, I had an AC Tyrant of Dire Straits deck. And one card that was in the pre-constructed deck that the commander came in, and it's a green staple, is Harmonize. I wasn't playing Harmonize in that deck. And I found myself, my commander does something so ludicrously good. I don't want the menial versions of this. Now, I played a couple cantrips just because eventually you have to get to 5 and 6 mana to cast your commander. But the big time effects of that, I did not want at all, because it turned into a point where, like, I have so many cards, I can only do so many things per turn, that it didn't make sense to have a Harmonize when really, I don't want to draw any more cards than AC already is going to draw me, which is already an unfair amount.
Truly, AC's absolutely ludicrous. But yes, that's a great example. Why would you play Harmonize in a deck where the commander is just like going to draw you 7 cards per turn, probably minimum? Like, I've seen what you can do with that deck. Like, 7's my lowest estimate.
There's a reason that deck doesn't even exist anymore, because it just became such a, oh wow, I drew 14 cards this turn. Guess I'm going to cast a 9 mana spell, whatever. The deck absolutely turned into, well, I did the thing and it was fun, but I have to challenge myself in a different way. Because for me personally, I only want to draw 27 cards
only
instead of like 74. in like one given cycle.
Yeah. And I think assuming you had access to an infinite number of like just good card draw effects, you wouldn't play them there.
No.
And like to use a more recent example, like take Obeka Splitter of Seconds, the new Grixis, like when she hits, you get that many extra upkeeps. Fantastic commander. Like that ability is cracked, not gonna lie.
Very, very, very wild, very powerful.
The thing that deck can do, like it cares about you having extra upkeeps. And there are a handful of other cards, like Paradox Haze, Sphinx of the Second Sun, that can give you extra upkeeps. But you don't actually need to play them all that much. Let's say that there were, a bunch of copies of those type of effects. Let's say that there were, 20 different variations of Paradox Haze that you could play in these colors. You wouldn't. Right? You actually wouldn't necessarily need to do that. Like even some cards like the Ninth Doctor, which can also give you extra upkeeps, even that is actually only showing up in roughly a quarter of Obeka decks. And I think that's kind of a sign that players are realizing, you know what, I don't need too much of this because the commander has that base so well covered, and I need to make sure that the 99 can complement that rather than reinforce that.
Yeah, but even then, when you look at a lot of the top commanders of all time, they're doing things that are often so powerful, they don't need to have any of these, well, I'm going to do another version of it, because it's already just so good. You can just supplant it and just lean away from what it's trying to do. Like Edgar Markov, for example. It is the best vampire maker. You don't need to make more vampires than what it's already going to be doing. So you can just kind of ignore that. And the fact that Eminence is the ability and it's as powerful as it is also kind of helps this example right here. But you don't need to do any token makers because you can just play your game plan out and then have some sort of payoff for having so many vampires. Edgar Markov is going to make you so many vampires. You don't need to overdo it on supporting those things because the main ability, it's just so good already.
Yeah. And to kind of take this and highlight an even more maybe extreme example here,
Sure.
I actually want to call out an article written by friend of the show Lenny Woolley, who wrote he writes the Power Sync series on EDHREC, where he's trying to take a famously ridiculously powerful commander and see if he can soften the edges a little bit, see if he can make something that's a little bit less socially whoa. And he wrote one about the card Grand Arbiter Augustine IV, which is, I think, the saltiest commander that exists. That's the blue-white one that increases the cost of your opponent's spells by 1, but it reduces the cost of your white spells and your blue spells by 1 mana. Honestly, kind of similar to the Honest Redstein example that I was giving earlier. And the way that Lenny attempted to approach a deck for Grand Arbiter was to obviously veer away from the thing that Grand Arbiter is famous for. It's famous for being a control, stacks, lockdown commander, playing a bunch of cards that prevent your opponents from casting spells efficiently, increasing the cost of their cards, making their stuff not able to untap. But that's kind of going into the same stuff that I mentioned earlier, right? Where players are seeing the commander does this thing. It does this kind of taxation effect. And then they're throwing a bunch more taxation on top of it. But the way that Lenny went was, again, he ran in the opposite direction there. And he decided to just make it a deck full of a whole bunch of Azorius beaters. Because he was just using the cost reduction. He was just like, you know what? These cards actually feel really great when you only have to pay 3 mana instead of 5 mana, or you can only pay 5 mana for a Drog Skull Reaver, or things like that. He just played a whole bunch of huge beaters, and he made it more of a tempo thing, because that's what the commander does. The commander, for him, was serving as a form of ramp. It was mana advantage in the command zone. That also was kind of bugging his opponents just a little bit. So, like, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
Grand Arbiter is still annoying as heck. Like, I think it's still got some socially rough stuff going on there. People don't like their taxes on their cards being increased.
Yes.
But it is interesting that we don't have that instinct inherently, right? Like, we see that the commander does thing X, so we try to throw a bunch more thing X into that deck too. When really, like, there is actually like room to play around with. Actually, the Grand Arbiter's already got that covered. Can we make it do something completely different instead? And I think Lenny was really tapping into that. And that's an interesting idea that I think is worth exploring a lot, to run away from what the commander already has covered.
So first off, I'm just going to point out, like, that is probably the most extreme example where I know Lenny. I love Lenny. Very much intentionally goes as far away from the grain as possible. But I think for a more accessible kind of example, when you look at another top commander, Kali of the Vast, it's all about cheating big things into play. Only 9% of decks are running Sneak Attack, which is historically like one of the best ways to kind of cheat things out ahead of time and get big beaters in there, get a big combat stuff like that. I think that's a very, very good and applicable less extreme example. Not that Lenny's example isn't valid, but
I think you're saying my example is a little bit extreme is what I'm hearing, which is true. Grand Arbiter is kind of like, I'm going as far to one end as I can to try and highlight what I'm trying to say.
But you did say it was an extreme example. I just want to make sure that we know.
Yeah.
But yes, I think, but Kali is kind of one that, I mean, again, 16,000 decks can't be wrong. Well, they kind of can be, but like sneak attack being in such a low amount of Kali decks, I think that's something that's kind of narrates, again, the point is the commander's already doing something. Let's just lean into it and just play more support cards instead of, well, let's just kind of go overboard with something that like you don't really need to be doing.
And to kind of highlight an example of like how this type of philosophy or how these conundrums can affect your deck building in like subtle ways as well. I'll use another recent example of an Elder Dragon Hijinks episode that I guested on, where I was playing Tolsimir Friend to Wolves. Matt, be proud of me. I played a Selesnya deck.
Selesnya deck. You have my attention at Tolsimir.
Yeah. I was playing Voya, but not that one. But that was... That was a fun thing to throw together. We were celebrating the Not a Wolf secret layer that Dan Sheehan was involved so much in. But that Tolsimir, when wolves enter, the wolves can fight. You'll gain life and the wolves can fight creatures. And when I started putting vegetable cards into that deck, the stuff that you need for the deck to truly thrive, including like having some interaction in the deck, the role that the commander played there of like, this commander can fight things, this commander can help me get rid of creatures, that had a big, like a material impact on the removal spells that I then wanted to use. Like I'm certainly absolutely going to play the classics. Path and Swords are 1 mana. It's like, those are amazing.
Sure.
It's not like I'm not going to play any other efficient creature removal.
Yeah.
But I noticed that I felt a lot more comfortable to flex a little bit more on other types of removal in that deck too. Removal that don't just hit creatures. Because with Tolsimir, every wolf maker that I had was also kind of a removal spell if I needed it to be. My token makers were also removal. So then the removal spell slots were the things that I had the most flexibility with. Mm-hmm. That is why I think the redundancy conversation is important. That's where you'll feel the most benefit.
So, Joey, you mentioned that you couldn't really find, you had too many of those things, like making wolves, because those were your removal spells. And it brings up an interesting question that I want to kind of ponder with you. So we've spent a lot of time talking about like when you kind of make things redundant and you don't need any more of those effects. Is there ever a time or a type of card even that you can never get enough of? I know that we've kind of gone deep into, well, you can't have too much of a good thing. Mm-hmm. Does that apply to everything though? Is there anything that it doesn't apply to?
Yeah, I would definitely say yes. Like chief among them is going to be card draw. I think. Like,
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Like I'm never gonna feel like, oh no, why do I have all these cards in my hand? I mean, unless someone's punishing me with a Vicious Shadows and making me take damage based off the number of cards in my hand, maybe. But like, that's a type of thing that'll never discourage people from playing a whole bunch of, especially if the commander doesn't draw cards. But even if the commander does help you draw cards, but that is a thing that you're going to have to like pay attention to carefully. Because like Matt, I do agree with you that AC. Your former AC deck, you don't need to play a Harmonize in that deck.
Yeah.
It's just like that is a level to me of just like redundancy and inefficiency compared to what the commander can do. But with that said, I'm never going to discourage you from having other things that also like match that efficiency that will also help you do what the commander is trying to do as well. So I would like slot that like, having no cards in your hand is such a bad experience in a game that if you go a little bit overboard on card draw, that's perfectly fine. That is the kind of thing I'm never going to feel bad about it.
I mean, to quote our friend Dana, who just, I mean, he's not here physically today, but I mean, Dana does love to say, like, I've never ended a game and thought, I have too many cards in my hand. Yeah. Like, it's always good having all the options. And so I do get where you're coming from. I think, again, it's entirely deck dependent because again, playing the AC deck, like there were some times decision paralysis takes over for sure. And so, the deck didn't have an issue with drawing too many cards, but the cards to support it didn't need to be there. One thing that I struggle with is finding the interaction. Is it possible to have too much removal? And sometimes I think we might actually disagree here because I don't think, especially when it comes to board wipes, that was another thing that the community kind of rallied around. Is it possible to have too much removal? And I think when it comes to board wipes, that especially is true. You can have too many board wipes.
Yeah, removal's a tough one. You're right. I did write down that it's hard to have too much interaction, too much removal in a deck, but you definitely can feel the effects of when a deck does have too much removal, when the game is dragging on and taking 2 hours.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's that's one of the things we remarked upon being concerned about for the format. Like, I know the internet loves to parodize Commander players and claim that they were just whining about Ward or whatever, but if you go back a few of our episodes, what you'll hear from us at least is that the side effect of Wizards putting Ward everywhere is how it means that the most efficient answer to a lot of Ward everywhere is for us to run more board wipes in all of our decks, which could, with a higher density of those, then cause more of those moments where a game is stalling out and taking forever. And that's where our concern was. But so, yeah, to your point, I think the reason I wrote down that it's hard to have too much removal is because, I mean, basically, I don't want to discourage anyone from playing a lot of interaction. I think generally, if your deck has more interactive cards, then you're way more likely to have enjoyable and successful games. But you're right that, yeah, there is absolutely a tipping point. that sixth board wipe of a game can just feel like a slog.
Absolutely.
Really, there is a tipping point for any of these. A deck with 60 card draw spells would be overkill too. So I guess it's not that you can't play too many of these effects, but just that I think compared to other deck categories, other staple effects like ramp, where you definitely can feel the effects of running too much because you'll flood out, or running like too many win cons because then your deck is all payoff with no setup. Things like removal and card advantage are just harder to go overboard on, but certainly not impossible, like you said. So anyway, I guess that's kind of my long-winded way of saying I'm coming around to your point.
Yeah, I'm glad that you're kind of coming on board with that, at least just selfishly, because I like having good ideas. But eventually, I want to get to a point where I don't want to stop people from playing the game entirely. But especially, the community has gotten, I think, a lot better about, playing too many board wipes, especially because there's just all these powerful commanders around. Just because it makes sure that everybody gets to actively participate in a game. And that's ultimately why people are playing Commander, is to play the game itself.
Are there other effects that you think you can't have too much of too, or are those the main ones, do you think?
I think those are the two that people talk about the most. I mean, I always never think you can have too many basics, but that's just me, and Dana's not here to tell me otherwise.
I get you on that. And if I'm being honest, I think there's also still going to be shades of gray to even the card advantage example. The point at which you are drawing, quote, too many cards is the point at which you're not affecting the board.
Yeah.
You're securing okay, late game value, but then you're not actually basically you're leaving it open for people to still attack you while you're trying to draw those cards, basically. There are obviously weaknesses to any one of these, but they will present themselves in different ways, and the effect of drawing a whole bunch of cards is going to be different than the effect of having too much mana and flooding out and not having anything to spend that mana on. So there's just things to pay attention to.
If they never make it to the battlefield, if they never get cast themselves, what was the benefit to having them? So I just to push back a little bit, but I think of with all things, moderation is the best. Now, yes, making sure you have enough to get by is very important, but I mean, again, if you have 20 cards in hand and you still lose the game, did it matter if you had all those cards in your hand?
Yeah, exactly. And for me, I think the kind of question that I, going forward, am going to ask myself when it comes to how many of these different things should I be playing in my deck? How many copies of my commander should I have? Or how many, whatever. I'm kind of asking myself, am I playing a deck here that does it want to lean in, or does it need to hedge its bets? Is kind of where I'm at. Having something that is effectively a duplicate of the commander is a version of hedging my bets. Whereas playing those Tamiyo safekeeping effects to make sure that the commander is protected, playing a bunch of things that will make sure the commander stays alive, that means I am leaning in hardcore to what that commander does. And that will affect the shape of the rest of my deck. A deck that leans in means I am expecting and trying very, very deeply to keep the commander in play at all times. And that could affect, whether I play, for example, lieutenant cards that get bigger based off of having my commander in play versus whether a commander doesn't need to be in play. If I am hedging my bets, I can have, quote, copies of that commander. Maybe it's less of a commander-centric deck, and it's something that I can actually, I don't need to cast Thales at all, actually. And maybe that'll affect how I play, because my opponents will expect me to cast the commander, and maybe they'll sandbag removal for when I do cast the commander, but I'm not going to, because I've got something else that I can do that will fill a similar role. And so that's the question to me to ask, are you leaning in, or are you hedging your bets? Because sometimes those cards don't necessarily cooperate with each other. You can, and by asking that question, you might be able to avoid dead draws, is kind of my big takeaway from this, I think, Matt. I don't know if that resonates with you, though.
I mean, reducing dead draws is I think every player can get better at them. Whether you've been doing a Commander podcast for 6 years or whether you've been playing for 6 games. I think the amount of dead draws that you get in any given game, the less the better, because that means you're getting more relevant draws that are going to contribute to the game more often. And that's just such a powerful thing to be doing, where knowing that the next card you draw has a better chance of being relevant. That's just such a powerful thing. And if you're trying to win more games, making sure that you have cards that are going to be relevant at all stages, that is a huge step in improving your win rate if that's what you're going for.
Mm-hmm. At all stages, including even if the commander is already in play. Like that's a thing that I'm also taking away from what we noticed about your decks, that we had a couple of those big examples right at the top of the show of like, here were cards that they could serve a function of replacing what the commander is doing, but they are also amplifying it or approaching it from a different level of attack. So that if your commander does get pinned to the field and loses its abilities, or you're not able to like do combat, you have something that's more direct damagey instead. And it's like getting around someone who has a permanent fog or glacial chasm type of effect in play. Like that is kind of like a thing that I'm taking forward, is like with my backup plans, I actually want to make sure that they approach from a completely different angle. In addition to asking myself whether I'm going to, am I hedging? Am I leaning in? And if I am leaning in, do I still have outs that will get me around a deck that is like shut off my usual route to a typical win condition by like fogging my Voltron commander or something? Like, what other options do I have? And specifically, if those options can do it in a different way, because if they can't, maybe that's a sign of a card that would be dead when I draw it during a game if things are already going for me. So yeah, those are the things that I'm trying to pay attention to, and I think that'll affect a lot of the density of certain effects that I have in my deck.
Yeah, it's just always good to just take an extra gander at when you're playing any given type of card, and again, challenging your own deck. People like to I really like this, but again, we talked about how I've played my Omnath deck more than any other deck that I have. I still look at that and think, okay, could one of these new cards that just came out truly be better than whatever I'm doing in there? Or do I need to actually add another backup plan? Do I need to add a Rampaging Balos type of card to the deck because it's just going to be better than what I've been doing? And yeah, being self-critical, it's really hard to do. I think a lot of people, no matter how long they've been playing the game, could always be better at that. And just, again, asking for input from your friends. Like, do you think that this was really scary when I played it? Because that's kind of why I play a lot of things. And just asking for that feedback, and then just accepting that feedback. And we've talked a lot about how to accept feedback on your decks. Looking for that feedback and then applying it for yourself and then giving yourself feedback. Man, that's one of those biggest things that you can be doing. Just if you're trying to improve the decks, being critical and just making sure that you're actually accepting that critical feedback, that's going to be huge.
Yeah, and accepting it from yourself, as you said. And I think this conversation only gets more potent as time goes on, because we're getting 48 legendary creatures per set, which means
we're getting so many.
Which means a lot of the same like draft archetypes are being represented in a lot of different ways by legends. So you'll encounter a lot of like these cards that are doing sort of the same things. And as you mentioned, we're getting a lot of different versions of those Tamiyo safekeeping type of effects. We're getting the Tyvar stand, and we're getting a whole bunch of different versions of those too. Mm-hmm. So both of these options to protect or to redundify our commanders, to have these backups, both of those options are swelling. And they can't all necessarily coexist in the same deck without sacrificing a lot of other staple categories you need. So you do have to kind of like find the balance and pick which one of them seems potentially most important. So that is like this conversation, I think, going forward, it gets trickier because of the types of things we're receiving now, which is why we have to start paying attention to it even more so than we did.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's wrap it up then. We've been talking a lot. We got pretty deep this episode. So I think I need a mental break. Maybe we'll see you next week, because I'm probably going to sleep it off for about that long.
Yeah, well, I'm going to go update my decks, because as I mentioned, I have them a little bit different in paper than I did actually in person. And I've changed a couple of things there.
How dare you?
I know.
I don't even know who you are anymore. I don't have a bad joke for our patron's name, and you haven't updated your decks in time. We're both betraying our identities.
Yeah, we're actually imposters. This is not the true EDHRECast. Okay, listeners, we've got to hear from you about like what is your approach to backup plans, and at what point does it feel like you've got a little bit too much of that? At what point are you getting those diminishing returns? Let us know in the comments. Hit us up. Leave a review as well. That's a cool way to support the show if you'd like to. And Matt, if folks want to find us online, where can they get a hold of you, dude?
So you can find me on pretty much any social media platform at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, we are proud members of Team Ultimate Guard, so make sure you check them out if you want the best decks, any just accessories for your Magic cards out there on the market.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me at Joseph M. Schultz everywhere online, and you can also find the cast at EDHRECast online. And if you've got a question for us, or perhaps a challenge the stats, you can contact us at edhrecast@gmail.com. Listeners, we'll be back at you next week with more data and insights, but until then, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.